The Diabetic podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first speaking to your doctor. Hello, Diabuddies. We are back, and we're back with another episode. This episode, we're going to be talking about running and getting into running and kind of the strategies that we have learned and implemented. But starting off, talking about the fear of running, especially as a type 1 diabetic, there's a lot of fear around it. And especially if you haven't done it before, getting into it can be pretty scary because getting low, a mile away from your house can be kind of scary. And if you're not prepared for that, obviously bad things can happen. So I'm going to turn it over and be asking a lot of questions to our running expert in the group here, Garrett. So Garrett, like when you started running, because I know you weren't necessarily like a big runner your whole life, but when you started kind of really getting into it, what were some of your fears in getting into it?
Well, when I started getting into running, it was more of, I guess at that point I didn't have a fear of low with running because I was already wrestling. I had already gone through the highs and lows of wrestling back in the day. But I knew that I needed to be able to check my blood sugar, right? And so I quickly bought a fanny pack when I feel like I bought a fanny pack to hold my glucose meter once I started running more than 3 miles. Because before, if you're doing 3 miles around 30 minutes or less, or a little bit more than 30 minutes, you can kind of prepare. You can check your blood sugar throughout the day and make a plan. But once you get that 30-minute mark, you should really know what's going on. And you need that data to make better decisions. If you continue to go past that. So for me, it was the low blood sugar is not a fun feeling, especially while you're running, because I've had that plenty of times. I know you have, right?
Yeah.
In fact, I had a recent scare of a low blood sugar. So I ran a marathon without a CGM not too long ago, and that was the first time I ran that distance without a CGM. But I had my fanny pack and I had my blood sugar, and I was being competitive, so I didn't want to check as much as possible. But I remember I checked, and this is kind of the opposite way. You're afraid of lows, right? So this is related to that, and that I eventually checked my blood sugar and it said like 336, and I was like, "What? That's super high." And I was like thinking through. I think the last time I checked, it was right before I started. It was like in the 200s because of nervousness and things like that. And so I was like, you know what, that might unfortunately be possible. But when you're running, you have to be careful because your insulin sensitivity is higher. And so I gave myself a unit of insulin and changed my basal settings. And, maybe 4 minutes later, I realized I was like, there's no way that's correct. And I rechecked with a clean finger, and I was like 100. I was literally like 106. And so going from 336 to 106 with my game plan and my decision, literally acting on it, I was like, oh crap, this is not good. And I literally consumed like 50 grams of carbohydrates on the spot between a goo, and which is just like an energy gel, and glucose tabs counteracted. But with that action, even that I had insulin now on board, and for a little bit, my basal rate was higher. By consuming while I was running, I counteracted that. And I think with all of fitness as a diabetic, one of the harder things, especially if you're trying to be on some kind of calorie restricted diet, we need to manage our sugar so that way we don't drop low. Because every time we drop low, we're going to need to consume some kind of form of calories to have carbohydrates. But, I was easily got 50 carbs in there, and I literally, I counteracted the insulin and my insulin sensitivity and the basal rate, and I was able to finish that fine. So I think, low blood sugar is scary, but if you know what to do when, that's how you counteract those fears.
And then also at the same time, being prepared, like you were prepared in any situation to where if something bad did happen like that, where you would drop super low, you'd be prepared. You had that stuff on you. And I'm sure there's also some stuff, if you're running a, certified marathon, there's booths and stuff around that have sugar of some sort.
Yeah, no, they those types of official courses definitely do have that. If you're running like a 5K, there might not be a medical 10, maybe there isn't at the end, but definitely not as common, I suppose. So,
Gotcha.
but being prepared, is definitely number one, and just being knowledgeable, because I think running is a great tool for a diabetic to continue to improve their overall sensitivity, to improve their fitness, their health, and it's a great tool, I think.
Yeah, yeah, definitely 100%. So so say somebody type 1 diabetic, hasn't done much running and wants to do a lot more running,
Hmm.
has a little bit of those fears. What type of strategies that can they do to be as prepared as possible for getting into running and making that transition smoothly?
Well, I think the easiest thing is, once it's think about it from a non-diabetic perspective. If once you're getting started, you're getting started. That's okay. It doesn't have to be a marathon. It should not be a marathon distance unless you're David Goggins or
Yeah.
something crazy. Um, if how does anybody get started running? You decide you're gonna go at the distance of maybe a mile, and you walk that whole mile, and you walk it. Maybe eventually you walk half of it and run another half of it, right? So getting started with the actual sport of running, you take it slow, and that's okay. And literally any work is better than no work, and that's the great thing. And we, as humans, we have legs. A lot of us. I don't know why I'm being so like specific, saying not all of us have legs, but um, if you have the ability to run, that's something that us as humans all share. And so that's something that we can easily just get started. You just need shoes, and you don't even need like really expensive running shoes. And you should, if you're going to be doing it more often, you should invest in some shoes or whatever else. But you know, start slow. And if you're starting slow with that, then check your blood sugar. And if you're doing a walk run, you can bring your meter with you if you don't have a CGM, and you could check it, before. How I would check it before is like, ideally you would do maybe like understand what's happening in your blood sugar 2 hours before you run, and from there you can maybe change your insulin, or increase your carbohydrate intake 2 hours beforehand, or maybe it's not 2 hours but maybe it's 1 hour beforehand, and so that way you really understand what your body's doing. And then at the right before you leave, maybe check another 30 minutes beforehand, say, okay, do I need to take my pump off, or can I leave it on? If I have a pump, do I leave my basal rate on, or do I turn it off, or do a percentage? Am I going to, if I don't have a pump, if I'm on MDI, then am I going to consume a juice box right now 30 minutes beforehand, or am I going to have a complex carbohydrate to kind of digest while I'm doing it? Am I low? Am I high? Those, you need to know what you're doing beforehand. And if, depending on your strategy of your walking, running, you can then use tools with you, and just kind of check along the way, or just kind of get through it and see what happens afterwards.
Yeah, I think it's especially important for a type 1 diabetic to start slowly, more so just because, not necessarily because we can't run that far. It's more so just so you can learn how your body adapts to that stress of running. So like running a mile and then rechecking to see, okay, what changed in that mile, and that 10 minutes of running, however long it took, what changed in my body? How fast did my blood sugar change? How did it change then 30 minutes after I stopped running?
Yep.
So you get that data slowly versus just kind of going out there and running 6 miles. That's harder to anticipate what's going to happen. Like, yeah,
Right.
you can drink a juice box or maybe 2 juice boxes. But if you don't really know if your body needs that or not and how quickly things drop, you ultimately don't know what's happening. Versus if you take it mile by mile, you start to understand, okay, at mile 2 or at mile 3, that's when things really start to drop. And that's when, okay, if I know if I run 3 miles, okay, I need a juice box beforehand, versus if I
Right.
only run 2, okay, I'm good if I just run 2.
Right. I think when I was really getting started, I would run without my pump, and then I was essentially trying to learn what was happening, and this was like years ago, trying to understand what my blood sugar would do without my pump, and as I increased the miles. But right around that 6 mile mark is actually for me, my blood sugar would go up. And so I use that in one of two ways. One, knowing that the confidence, essentially, once I get past the 6 mile mark, I've learned my blood sugar stabilizes, and it's not as reactive to that. So it's not like this big, essentially you almost work through all of your insulin on board and you work through all your digestion. Once I'm at that 6 mile mark, it's pretty much, what does my body need to keep fueling and keep going? And your body's going to naturally increase its blood sugar by dumping its liver stores, and cortisol might go up depending on the type of run. But when I was starting out, I didn't use a pump at all, but now I've gone to the point where I understand what that does and doesn't do. And so it's like we always harp on, it's all about data, right? And the fear of lows, I always have sugar on me, always. You always keep glucose tabs on you. You can always counteract what's going on. And if you want and feel comfortable, you can bring your phone with you and you can literally just stop. Good thing about running is you can stop and then take care of yourself. And then you could have somebody pick you up if you're able and fortunate, you Uber, whatever have you, you can figure it out from there. But once you stop running, it's going to stop being this big downward spiral.
Mm-hmm.
Have you had any experiences with low blood, or maybe a question I want to ask you, is there a cue that you have specifically noticed about your body when you get a low blood sugar while you're running?
I would say it's pretty similar to just normal low blood sugar, in a sense that, I kind of get lightheaded. I would say when it gets to like a somewhat severe low, I feel like my coordination isn't as good. Like I feel like I don't know if this is a good term, but like loose and like flappy, to where it's like it's not like precision, like foot strike and arm swing. So I feel like my coordination isn't as good. And then I've gotten to a point one time where I ran a little bit further than I was used to. So almost always I run about 3 miles. There's one day, and this is years ago, but one day I ran like 4 miles, and I didn't prepare well enough for it, and I got low like halfway through, and I'm like, well, I'm halfway through, so it's not like I can go back and it's going to be less distance. Like I gotta I gotta just finish it out. And that's when I really noticed less coordination. But then at the same time, like I almost felt like my legs were numb, to where like I didn't have like full control of them. It was kind of a weird experience. But
yeah, I've had maybe sometimes I've experienced like lack of coordination or decrease in coordination as you're running. But for me, and sometimes I do feel like that low blood sugar feeling, but sometimes I don't. But sometimes or most times I will actually feel maybe how you describe a lack of coordination, but rather my suboccipital muscles will get looser. And so I feel like I'm bobbing my head more. Actually, what with low blood sugar. And so your suboccipital muscles are the muscles right underneath your skull, essentially, and in your neck. And they have one of the highest mechanoreceptors of any muscle, right? And so fancy term, all that means is they're very responsive to mechanical change. These muscles. And for me, when my blood sugar dips, these muscles in the back of my head get a little bit looser, I feel like I start bobbing. And so that's always a cue for me, like, man, I really need to check, or I need to do something right now. For sure, which I always thought was an interesting cue. But you can still feel the low blood sugar symptoms that you normally do at the same time. Your body will still give you those same alerts.
Yeah. So now I've always wondered this, which is, okay, you feel low blood sugar, or you feel like your blood sugar's off. How do you personally, how do you check in the middle of a run? Do you literally stop, or have you ever tried checking it while running? I'm sure you have, just because I know you, but
so I try not to, when I don't have my CGM, like I haven't for a while now, I would stop and check and react that way. But so I literally, from today, this recording, 8 days ago, ran, a marathon, and that I wish I almost practice running and not checking it, because my competitiveness was I didn't want to stop, you
Yeah.
know. And so I had my fanny pack on and I would swing it around to my front. So the fanny pack would literally be in like in my abdomen. And I'd be like, I would slow my pace down and I would take everything out one by one. And there was one point when I dropped my lancet or my poker, and I would turn around and I would pick it up. But that would be very few times am I checking while I'm running. Now, sometimes, most times, I will consume food while I run, even during training runs. So whether that be energy gel or glucose tabs or something else, I will do that often while running, so that way I don't have to stop my timer. It's always an ego thing of, oh, well, I'm diabetic, this is part of me, I should probably include my time, like my time stopped in it. But at the same time, it's like, well, this is something I'm already battling so hard to run and do and conquer this disease and like do this training run. Screw it. I'm going to stop it and just say it's not affecting my time. And so a lot of times I'll just stop my timer there. But like today, I did a 5 mile run, and normally I have a fanny pack on me or my pump, my phone, I have all these things on me. And one of the great things about running is you can feel so free. But we've talked about this in past episodes where sometimes this diabetes can feel like an anchor. And most of the times I don't feel like that when I'm running, but man, do I sometimes wish I could just run without anything on me.
Yeah.
So like today I ran with shorts that had underwear built into it. And so I just wore that, didn't wear a shirt, no, and I had my watch on, a heart rate monitor, but I didn't bring my pump, didn't bring my phone. I had glucose tabs and a gel. And I would just, if I got the low blood sugar feeling, I brought those with me for those moments. But I was 160 going into the run. I had I had 2.5 units of insulin on board from like an hour and a half ago. And so I was like, okay, well, I know I'm going to dip down. So I assumed that I would probably just consume food at some point, some glucose tabs. And I got some pretty big low blood sugar symptoms around mile 2. And so then I stopped and I consumed 5 glucose tabs. And by another 0.8 miles went by, had another 3 glucose tabs, and I got home and I was at 90. And so during the time of me consuming glucose tabs, I just stopped and I ate them and I walked while I did it. The second I was done, I continued to run. So, you can get some reps in there, but, low blood sugar is scary without a doubt. But I think the risk to reward ratio of crossing that barrier of like running for the first time with diabetes is definitely worth it.
Yeah. And then not only that, like you mentioned before, but just like the benefits that you notice long term doing running or training consistently is just, I mean, I can't even describe how much easier it makes your diabetes because you're so much more insulin sensitive. And what that insulin sensitivity does is it just allows you, I feel like it allows me to have more wiggle room within my day. Like if I don't take quite as much as I should have, and or I eat a little snack like and I forget to take insulin for it, like I don't feel like it's as impactful if I've been training consistently versus not so much. So I think, like you said, it's hugely beneficial. You just have to be prepared for it.
Right. So maybe, Grady, this is a good time to talk about what happens to our blood sugar while we run. So in my mind, I think you have a couple thoughts about just where we could take this conversation here. But in my mind, what's happening when you're steady going into a run versus high, which I think we could talk about too. That's really important, versus low going into it, and what you could do whether you're on pumps or shots. In those different scenarios. So where do you want to start with what happens to your blood sugar while you're running?
Yeah. So I guess maybe just kind of starting off with, let's say it's in a good range or upper good range, whatever that means for you. Because that means a little bit different for everybody. But on the upper end of a good range, so there's obviously several different strategies you can use to manage your blood sugar for the run. If you know you're going to be dropping low, like your body responds by dropping low or dropping your blood sugar, especially on that initial part. You can, if you have time and or a good schedule, you could change your basal rate going into the run. So that window is obviously a little bit different for everybody. Everybody responds either slower or quicker to their insulin changes. So for me, it takes a little bit longer. So if I were to change my basal rate, like doing a temp basal rate or something like that, I would probably start like an hour at least beforehand. That may be different for everybody, but decreasing it, and that's something again you have to play with a little bit, whether you're decreasing it by half or even stopping it before going. That's something I feel like if you're going on a short run, you need to do it beforehand versus doing it right when you start running, because the change is immediate. Whereas immediate as far as what the exercise is doing to your blood sugar, versus the basal rate, that takes a while for that change to happen. So you need to do it well beforehand if you're going to use that strategy, which is why for the most part I just use sugar beforehand. If I'm just doing a short run, which I only do short runs, I just use juice boxes. So I'll drink a juice box, and I use juice boxes because having a lot of stuff in my stomach or having food in my stomach isn't great for the running experience of it. And at the same time, the juice is also very fast acting, so it's going to counteract any severe drops or quick drops pretty quickly. So I typically just use juice boxes beforehand, preemptively, if I'm in that good range or low range. What about you?
Yeah, so there's so many factors you could play with, right? So if I'm good or a little bit higher right beforehand, definitely you start to lower your basal rate like 30 minutes, an hour beforehand, if you're even thinking about it. But like, let's say you wake up and you're trying, like often I'll wake up like and try to run right away and get to work afterwards, right? Which might be common for anyone that works, or if you're in school, you might try to run in the morning. Let's say I'm like good and I'm trying to get out of the door in 30 minutes or less for a run. That's when you immediately need to change, if you got a pump, change your basal rate, but realize, or take your pump off if you got a pump. But if you don't have a pump and you have long acting insulin, you probably most people that do long acting insulin give a shot the night before. Some might, with their healthcare provider, decide to do it in the morning, but you'll definitely be quicker to have lows if you do long acting insulin beforehand, long acting insulin at night. And even definitely I would imagine you'd have quicker lows if you did long acting insulin in the morning and you try to run. I'm sure you would just be plummeting. Right. And so if that's the case, you might need to have, if you don't have the pump benefit of changing your basal rate, you're definitely gonna need to stack those carbs much higher than somebody else. And probably juice, whether you probably might need like 2 glasses of juice, like 16 ounces of like lemonade versus like a 15-gram juice box. You need to play around with those things, but essentially, you could turn your pump off, if that's a factor, and have some juice. But if you don't have a pump, you're gonna just need to stack those carbohydrates, a decent amount, depending on the distance that you're going to be going, without a doubt. But it's definitely possible as you're stacking these things, because when you mess with your pump, it's going to, like you said, affect you. It's going to take a while to affect you, right? And if you are running more than a mile, then in that case, you might be hitting yourself with a lot of lack of control. You might be giving yourself a lot of carbohydrates and no insulin, and you might not be running super hard, which is fine. But then your blood sugar might not go down. It might actually just go up and keep going up, which I've definitely been frustrated with. You as a self-experimentation game of, man, I shouldn't have lowered my insulin that much and ate that many carbs. I probably only needed to do one or the other, and I would have been fine, in some scenarios. So it's, depending on your distance, what you're doing, you might need to play with both of those levers or tools. But chances are you might just need one of them. or, depends on the scenario.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely, going back to like the MDI or daily injection type person. I mean, I pretty much do or strategize my running like an MDI would, because I don't change my basal rates. I keep my pump on while I run.
Sure. And that's
And,
probably majority of pump users too.
yeah, hell yeah. And so basically because I don't run that far. So I don't necessarily feel like it's worth, messing with my basal rates. If I'm only running 3 miles, which is about 30 minutes or less, then I feel like that's not enough time to warrant a basal rate change, at least
Right.
for me. And so I just use juice boxes and or taking insulin. Like if I'm really high and I'm using running to bring it down, I may take a little bit of insulin with that. But yeah, it's very similar to what like an MDI person would use.
So I want to use that to ask you. So let's say you're high. Let's use. We might have talked about this in a previous episode, but I think it's important to as we're discussing running again. If
Mhm.
you're, do you differentiate when you're a high versus, let's say you're 180 versus 200 versus 250 versus 300? You probably rarely go more than 300, but if you're more than 300, I mean, you've had pump kinks before.
Oh yeah.
Crap happens when you're diabetic. Didn't swear that time. Crap happens when you're diabetic, right? And so that might lead your blood sugar to be really high. So have you had personal anecdotes, and plus kind of talk to us at that point what your blood sugar is doing when you're that high and trying to run, and what's your both your personal experience, and talk us through what your body might be doing at that point.
Yeah. So let's maybe talk about the extreme highs first. So like when I have had, I think the most recent one was I had some sort of pump malfunction. I can't remember exactly what it was. It was either the site. I don't think it was the site. I think it was more so something along with the tubing. But at any rate, I was going up, and this was like the middle of the night. So sleep also plays a role in how that impacts stress too. But at any rate, my blood sugar was high. It was continuing to go high despite me trying to give myself insulin through my pump. And I realized, and I was taking like 5 units, because I think at this point it was like in the mid 300s. And then by the time I decided, all right, I'm going for a run to help bring it down, it was like in the 400s. So this is a pretty extreme. And so essentially I was trying to take like 5 units at a time, waiting to see if it changed at all, and then rechecking. It didn't change, it actually went up. So then I'm like, oh crap. I tried it again, still no change. All right, change my pump. I change all the stuff in my pump to get a new site. And then at that point, I can't tell you exactly how many units I took. It was definitely a severe amount, because I'm very emotional when it becomes high. And so it was a very extreme amount. I know when I took it, I'm like, I almost want to drop low more so than anything else. And so I was like, I know the risk, I'm going to take it. And so when I did that run, because I wanted to get it down as fast as possible, because at this point I felt like total crap. Like I like that dehydrated feeling that I get when I get really high. I mean, I was miserable. So I'm like, I might as well be miserable and run versus miserable and lay in this bed.
Okay.
And so so with taking a ton of insulin and then deciding to go for a run, obviously there's a lot of danger in that. And so I didn't run very, very far away from the house.
Okay.
I ran like around the block kind of. So probably a mile at most. I don't think it was quite that far, but I think in total I ran about 20 minutes because I ran around the block a couple times. And so at any rate, I use that to bring that down and bring it down quicker. Obviously, that's a very extreme case, but at the same time, It can be really helpful. You just have to be really careful if you're doing an extreme correction, because it does come down very fast once you start moving, because now you're mobilizing that insulin further around in the system. And so it's getting to those tissues quicker, which then those tissues start to soak up that glucose. Now, on a more reasonable scale, when my blood sugars, let's say in the 200s, which,
well,
go ahead.
before getting there,
Mhm.
so, and you mentioned, like, so this happened probably throughout the night when you were going high, right, with the pump
Yeah.
malfunction. So, and that impacts your sleep, right? So, what's going on there that is counterproductive to trying to get your blood sugar down? What's the type of cascade that's going on that's impacting your sleep? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, because when your blood sugar is that high, you're going to have a lot of cortisol running through your system, especially if it's affecting your sleep, because poor sleep also then is going to raise your cortisol, and then high blood sugar is going to raise your cortisol, just as well as low blood sugar does. And so then that makes you then less insulin sensitive, and at the same time also increases your blood sugar, because cortisol will convert or help convert protein into sugar. So you're going to be getting more sugar, even though you already have too much sugar.
Right.
And so that's why it oftentimes is a lot harder and takes more insulin to bring down those severe highs versus using your normal, ratio, like
Right.
15-1 ratio on a normal high. On a higher high, it's probably going to take a little bit more. And then at the same time, like I said, I like using some form of exercise. Typically it's running, to help bring it down a little bit faster. And there's a little bit more going on to it in those severe highs. And that's why I like having that little bit of extra help with that exercise, because then not only will it bring it down quickly, but it'll help bring it down to a little bit better level than if I just took the insulin.
Yeah, so you mentioned cortisol is going to be high from multiple factors. You mentioned, your body's going to be breaking down protein. So that's going to be from both kind of skeletal muscle, but and just kind of anywhere where it can, right? On top of that, if your blood sugar is getting high, let's say you ate right before because you pumped in malfunction, right, before you went to bed, your digestion is going to slow down and maybe even like barely move. So you're going to have you might have food in you, and digestion is slower. And that in itself might throw some inflammatory markers in you, and it just continues to impact your blood sugar being high. And so you brought up a point of your insulin sensitivity is changing it. And I think most people don't even have a plan when your blood sugar gets that high. There should be almost a ratio in the back of your mind. Well, I'm normally 15-1. Maybe you're 5-1 at that point, for even that's carb, that's a carb to insulin ratio, but
or like 50-1 versus 20-1.
Yeah, some people use ratios actually based on your blood sugar, right? So every 50 units above 120 is 1 unit or something like that. Maybe that becomes much smaller. So that's even good strategy to have ahead of that. And I think for me personally, like, it's so frustrating because I never want to run, because I'm a more stressed out person than Dr. Grady, probably. He meditates better than myself. He's just more aligned with whatever longitude, latitude is going on in the world. and so for me, I personally have such a higher response to when I'm that inflamed and that high, that I will literally, if I try to run when I'm that high, the inflammation from running will keep it high. And I literally can't, like, you run to get down. Sometimes I'm able to run and get down. Sometimes I run and it stays high, and it does not feel good at all. And so for me, I literally, if I'm like over 300, especially if I wake up with a pump malfunction, I try to wait till I'm down. But at that point, you're giving yourself so much insulin that like pushes everything hours and later maybe to use the insulin to get yourself down. But if you have 15 units on board or something crazy like that, that's still in your system. You don't want to run when you have that much insulin, even that your blood sugar might be lower now. You need to then make sure you're not going to be fighting lows the whole time. So like you said, you were running around the house. So it becomes a very much more dangerous situation if you're going into a run and you're that high and you've been trying to do it. So you can use run as a strategy to help you get down, or realize that might be counterproductive and might even put you at a worse scenario. So I always err on the side of not running when I'm that high, and just kind of biting the bullet and having to move my schedule around.
Yeah. Yeah. I think 2 points out of that. Like, so whether you are running to get that down or not, if you have a lot of insulin on board, I think it's very important that if you're doing some sort of exercise to bring that down, you want to make sure that you're not putting yourself in a situation where you can't save yourself. So like in my case, staying close to the house, and making sure that if I do start dropping low, I'm not very far, so I can still make it and drink a juice box or something. And then the second point being that in the terms of strategy and bringing that down quicker, like in Garrett's case, running, and he's more of a sympathetic guy, so more of a stressed guy, I guess you could say.
I'm just excited for life more than you. I don't know what to tell you.
Yep.
My mom was only in labor for about a minute, and I just jumped out because I was that excited.
But yeah, so in those types of scenarios, the harder you push your body, like exercise is a form of stress. So like the harder you push your body, sometimes that's not going to respond the way you want it to, and by increasing your sympathetics and or cortisol. So in those cases, it might be a good idea just to do some light exercise like walking to bring it down faster, or something very, very calm, but still getting your body moving, getting your blood pumping a little bit better, getting that insulin spread around versus going for a run.
And as if you're doing something else, right, you be careful not to do a HIIT type style. Like a lot of people like squats, and I think that's great. But if you all of a sudden you do a bunch of things, a HIIT training raises blood sugar too, right? And in the short term. And so you want to be careful of that HIIT or high interval intensity workout training. You want to be careful of that type of backfiring on you. But yeah, try something light. Try it. Just move it. Movement is better, without a doubt.
Now, with all this going on, I want to hear from you, like some of your strategies, especially on like the long runs, because that's where it gets a lot more complicated. Because like you said, at certain points you're dropping low, but then at the same time, there's other points where you may be actually increasing. So talk about that and some of your strategies with different scenarios going into it.
So to learn about longer distances, right, or how your body's going to react, it's going to be trial and error, and you need to either have a CGM or be checking while you're running. And if you're going on a longer run, let's just even say it's like a 10K, 10 kilometers. And so that's about 6.2 miles. Yeah, 6.2 miles. And, if you're doing that type of distance, trying writing down what you try beforehand and what's happening during it, right? So when it comes to handling long distances, you need the data for sure. I've got it dialed in so much where here, let me actually read you. So what I did on my last 20-mile training run, and what happened during it before this most recent marathon. So I was actually on a track. So I ran 20 miles on a traditional track.
Oh my God, that's torture.
It wasn't that bad. What's 4 laps times 20? I did 80 laps. No,
Jeez.
Yeah, 80 laps. What's 4 times 20? 80? Yeah. So it wasn't as bad. I watched all the high schoolers go to take PE and whatnot. It was funny. And then rec soccer players. But anyways, I digress. So let me read you what I did, and this was without a CGM. So I woke up in the middle of the night, and I was 270 because I had Chinese food because I was carving up before this run. I woke up at 4:54 a.m. I was 270, middle of the night, and I gave myself the proper amount of insulin to correct for that. So I woke up, essentially 90 minutes later. I woke up at 6:31 a.m. and I was 101, right on the dot.
Nice.
And so at that point, I didn't have any food, didn't have any water. I had no food or no insulin. I just had I had some water and I had some electrolytes. That's what I was having at that point. So that was initially at 6:30. At 7:30 minutes later, I would drop down to 76. At that point, I had 54 grams of carbs. So I had a bagel and cream cheese. And I did a square bolus of that. So I didn't bolus for like 5+ units. I did three, like I reduced my insulin to carb ratio, and I put that over 45 minutes. So I did like 3.75 units over the course of 45 minutes. And then I changed my basal to 75%. So my thought was, okay, I just had consumed carbs. I know I didn't have enough insulin for that amount of carbs. So I know I'm going to be trending higher, but the idea was to, I'm 76, to trend maybe high enough and not have that much insulin on. So that way I can steadily decrease and not have as much insulin. But I've learned where if I had complex carbs before a long run, because that's something different, right? On a long run, you do need complex carbs beforehand for your muscles not to give out on you and not to bonk. So it's this balance of consuming carbohydrate, but not giving enough insulin, or not giving too much insulin, but not giving no insulin. So it's this delicate balance there. So that's what I did for that. And so about 45 minutes later, I turned my basal to 0 and I just shut it off. And I was at 124. So 45 minutes later, I went from 76 to 124. And I had 15 grams of carbs in the form of juice. I thought I was a little bit too close to the bullseye with my insulin and things like that. So I had a little bit of juice, turned my pump off. And then about 10, 15 minutes later, I began my run at around 8:09 a.m. So that was all that work. That was 90 minutes of work of understanding my blood sugar, insulin, even before I go on this 20-mile run. So I start my run around 8:09, and then around 10 minutes later, I don't know why I must have been feeling bad. I must have been feeling low. 10 minutes later at 8:19, I was 83. So I was going down. So at that point, I had one GU, which has 23 grams of carbohydrate, and then I had 4 glucose tabs and 16 grams of fast acting carbs. And that was at 1.5 miles in. So I checked in at 1.5 miles into the run, and I had whatever 23 plus 16 is the amount of carbohydrates, but 16 of that was glucose tabs. So then that was at 1.5 miles. And then at 3.5 miles, so 2 miles later, and this was I wrote all this down afterwards. So I was making all the decisions in real time, and I was like, I need to write all this down before I forget, because I did this perfectly. and but this is what it takes, right? When you're doing, sports like this, having the information, understand what your body does. This is where it all comes really in handy. So at 3.5 miles, I was 72. So I was still I was going down even after I had all that amount of carbs 2 miles later. So at that point, I didn't have complex carbs. I just had fast acting. I had 4 glucose tabs, so 16 grams of carbs at 3.5 miles. My basal rate's at 0 at all this. So then around mile 7, so another 3.5 miles later, I didn't check, but I had a GU. And so I was like, okay, I should be I might be close to the line, but I know I need the carbs. So I just had a GU at that point. So around mile 7, I had a GU. And I'll summarize this all. I have this much more concise because this is very detailed. I'll kind of summarize this 20-mile run in a little bit. So then around, when was this? So that was around mile 7. And then around 9:37, so about an hour after I was at 3.5 miles, so somewhere around mile 12 or 10 or something. Then this is where I learned the lesson of that I told that story earlier, was I was 236. And I was like, man, could I be 236? I was like, I didn't check my blood sugar. I didn't have that data. I just had that GU. Maybe my blood sugar did increase that much. But I checked a minute later and I was 107. And I was like, okay, well, that doesn't seem right. Something's off right now. And I tried washing my hands, and then I checked again. I was 145. So I was like, okay, definitely not 236. There's some truth in between 107 and 145. And I've been consuming sugar. Sugar's on my fingertips. I'm not cleaning properly. I'm sweaty. There's salt on me. This is all making these readings not that accurate, right? So what I decided to do was I was drinking my electrolyte drink that I had some dextrose in it, had some sugar. So I wasn't using Gatorade. I was using a different supplement. So I had some like sugar water. I had 2 glucose tabs. So I think I had somewhere around 10, 12 grams of carbs. And it said first ready had goo on. Oh, okay. That was me making the note saying I had goo on my fingers for the first one. So that was, that was around the 10-mile mark that this all happened. So I had about 12 grams of carbs around the 10-mile mark, essentially is what ended up happening. So then I didn't check around 5 miles later. So at this point, I know, okay, my onboard insulin is gone. My body's just burning it. So I didn't check. And again, I was trying not to check a lot because I was trying to really understand I was trying not to check going into the race that I just did.
Yeah.
And so I wanted just to see what would happen. So 5 miles later, I had a goo after all that. Around mile 15, I didn't check. And then around mile 17, which ended up being around 10:52 a.m., I was 132. So I'm still like, I'm having all these grams of carbs and I'm just fighting it. Right.
Yeah.
And so at that point, all I had was about 8 grams of carbs from glucose tabs. So I had 2 glucose tabs and that was it. That was a mile 15 or mile, that was at mile 17 that I was at. And then about 11:08, I finished my 20 miles. I didn't check. And because I was like, well, I'm 132. I had 2 glucose tabs. I'm too tired. I'm just going to get home. Right. And so I waited. And the reason why you don't want to check and act right after a big long run is because you just consumed all these carbs. Your body's calming down. I mean, especially when you're running that high amount and not on like an unnatural surface like a track, that's type of stimulus to your body, that's taxing your central nervous system. So you need to be very cautious in what you do. And if you're low, you need to act on it. But you don't want to overcorrect if you're high because you're going to be more insulin sensitive, all these things. So I essentially waited 45 minutes. I calmed down and took a shower. And 11:49 a.m. So about 40 minutes after the run, it was 1:45. And that's when I, did, I had carbs because it was post run. I had like so I didn't write, said 100 plus grams of carbs is what I wrote down. I can't remember what I ate afterwards. It must have been a lot. I must have been starving.
Yeah.
So let me summarize all of that. And the totals, in a 20-mile run, I had 3 goos, 12 glucose tabs, and some dextrose water. That led to 137 grams of carbs while I was running. I stopped to check 4 times and I acted twice without checking. And then to summarize that more, it led to, let's see, the plan became this. And to my race, that was like a lot of data for that. So at mile 1.5, I had 1 goo, 4 glucose tabs. Mile 3.5, I had 4 glucose tabs. 7 miles, 1 goo. 10 miles, 2 glucose tabs. At 15 miles, I had 1 goo. 17 miles, 2 glucose tabs. So all of that information, like then I took that into my most recent run or race, and that would only work if I was 101 when I woke up and started my 90-minute prep, right? Mm-hmm. So it's all this learning and all this understanding of what happens to your body with each type of run. And that was a little bit excessive because 20 miles is a lot. It's a lot of carbs and it's a long time to be on the road, right? But that was actually one of my best runs I've ever done for 20 miles too. So it was like
just like from a pure performance standpoint.
Yeah, from performance, my times were really, really low. My heart rate was good. That was awesome. I was really happy with that run, and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna kill this marathon. At that point, that was like a month before, which was too late. But so that was a big story. And to kind of make it more applicable to anyone, it's when you're doing longer runs, you need the data. You need the data. You need to be comfortable with consuming carbs. When you have lows, like I got down to 76. I've run on lower, and you have that's when you jump up the carbohydrate intake, whether from fast acting, complex that you have on you, and you start slow and you build up to something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just that story in general just kind of illustrates the complexity of doing those longer runs, but then at the same time, just like everything that goes into it, and really like like that's I feel like hearing that is somewhat intimidating just because
Yeah.
there is like so much going on, and it definitely can be, but at the same time I feel like it's very necessary just to make sure like nothing bad does go wrong, especially
Right.
if you're like on the track it's not as big a deal,
Mm-hmm.
but if you're just running on the road, man, bad things happen quick,
Yeah. You're
and
far away.
yeah, you're far away. And so like having that data not only beforehand before you go into it, but then at the same time, while you're running, to making sure like, okay, everything's going good, going smooth, or maybe it's
Mm-hmm.
not, and you make those corrections. But yeah, so yeah, it's surprising to hear. Well, I mean, it is and it isn't, but it's surprising to hear how much you sometimes have to intake while you're running. So like you said, like 137 grams of carbs. That's, for me, that's like a whole day or more, or actually probably a lot more than a whole day for me.
And that was on glucose tabs and gels.
Yeah.
That wasn't even good tasting food because I was starving afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's but I'll refer to anyone who's still listening to this episode, this point, to if you've gotten this far, listen to our interview with Don Muchow. I mean, he's run from Disneyland to Disney World, coast to coast, with type 1 diabetes, and he was scared to run. And that was it. He didn't start running well until his 40s.
Mm-hmm.
To really start getting into it. Now he's doing all these crazy ultra marathons and things like that. And you start slow and you build up to it, but at that point, it's a fuel game. But when you're casually running, which is great, when you're walking and running, it's all great forms of to increase your fitness, increase your insulin sensitivity, to help you just go towards the better version of yourself, right? I think running is very freeing, and there's can be a lot to be said about that too.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah. Yeah. So I have basically one more question for you.
okay.
And I'll kind of give you an example so you understand what I'm trying to get at. But
Okay.
so like what are some like scenarios or some things that will cause you to maybe have a different response to running? So like, for example, with me, if I have a lack of sleep, a severe lack of sleep, and or a severe stressful event, I will actually, like, I almost never spike when I run, like go high.
Yeah.
But if I have a lack of sleep and or have been fasting for a long period of time, I will actually sometimes increase my blood sugar. So is there any scenarios for you that sometimes give you a different response than what you will traditionally
Mhm.
experience?
Yeah, definitely lack of sleep is something to point to number one. If you're not sleeping, whether you're high or low, but like, if you're lack of sleep, your body is going to act differently
Mm-hmm.
without a doubt. And if anything, I feel like my blood sugar, while being, the past few months, I've recommitted to my sleep, and I'm trying to get over 7 hours, ideally 8 hours every time I go to bed. I try to go to bed by 8:30 at night, and try to get ready by 8 and go to bed. But beforehand, I was doing all this running, and I was not sleeping a whole lot. I mean, I remember 2 years ago waking up at 3 a.m. and running at 3:30 a.m. and just doing all this crazy stuff. But I bring this up to say I feel like my blood sugar has been more easily controlled, and I can predict how it's going to happen. And I'm also able to make the better decisions because I am sleeping, and my brain's just functioning better. Your brain,
Yeah.
if you didn't know, your brain functions better when you sleep. Even as a doctor of chiropractic and master's in nutrition, it took me this long to practice that. And I was preaching that before I was practicing it. But I'm able to even make better decisions going into a run and on the run, to see how it affects. So for sure, lack of sleep is going to impact that kind of stuff. Um, Other than that, I would actually say running in the morning versus running during the day.
Mhm.
Um, Running during the day, I'm going to be more fatigued just because of the day. Chances of me having caffeine and coffee and maybe bad food or good food or events with low blood sugar will make that run during the day more complex. versus running in the morning where it's like controllable. What is my blood sugar? I literally have the first say of the insulin I'm going to put in my body if I'm going to do that, the first say of exactly what kind of carbs are going to be in my body to impact that run. And not only that, when I'm running, from just a runner's perspective, when you run during the middle of the day, whether it's a hot season or not, I mean, your heart rate is going to be probably higher in the middle of the day, just being awake longer. So that's going to be more stressful for your body, and that can then impact your blood sugar then as well. So I think it has all those aspects to, it's definitely better to run in my opinion, and personally, easier to run in the morning versus running in the middle of the day.
I got you. Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. There's just a whole lot less variables you have to navigate.
So let's say, kind of not focusing on the long distance stuff. Probably last thing, I want to say, how do you make the decision of complex carb? Let's say, because you don't mess around with your basal rate, right? Kind of bring it back to one point, and then we might, kind of end it after that. But for somebody who doesn't mess around with basal rates, when you're doing medium distance, well, you say 3-4 miles, but let's say if you're going to try to run 6 miles, are you going to have a combination of complex carbs versus and fast carbs, or how are you going to make that decision going into that run?
Yeah, I think for me, I would let's push it out a little bit further. Let's go like 6+, which I've never ran that far before. I think I've gone like 6.
You run 6 miles once at least, yeah.
Yeah, I think I've run the loop at our old house twice.
Yeah,
so that would be like 6.2 or something like that.
That was like a perfect 5K. That was great.
Oh yeah, it was awesome. But really? Yeah, so if I ran that far, I can't remember what I did at that point. I think I just drank a couple juice boxes, and then I probably changed my basal rate, because that's what I would do is prepare for that initial drop by drinking the juice boxes, and then try to mitigate a further drop in the longer distant ranges by doing a temp basal rate. And again, I think it would be good if I were to ever want to run that far, to do it slowly, mile by mile, just to see, is there a point like you were talking about where my blood sugar starts to spike and or level off, or does it just kind of always keep going down for me?
Yeah. So I think that's I wanted to ask that question, hear what you had to say, because I think it's more likely if you're getting into running or you're a runner that you're going to be in that 1 to 6 mile range, right? So it's like you have all these tools. You have your potentially a basal rate change with a pump. You potentially have the addition of juices and fast acting carbohydrates. You can bring carbohydrates with you. I mean, if you're doing a loop like you kind of described, I mean, you could literally stop and eat something and then, at your house, and then turn back around and do it again, right? And so you have the ability to do these things. I know I've read diabetic running stories where they lay out juice boxes, like if it was like, a race at certain mile markers, and that's how they kind of do it too. And so you could even do that, right? If you want to take your car and you were going to do like a 3-mile run walk with a friend or something like that, you could, 1.5 miles down the road, you can put a juice box there with your car and then pick your friend up and do your run walk or whatever you want to do. So there's lots of availabilities, but so what would if somebody came up to you at your office tomorrow, Dr. Grady, and said, "Doc, you inspire me. I'm a type 1 diabetic just like you. I want to run, what's a sentence that you can tell me what I should do?"
Don't run.
Wow. Okay. Kidding. Podcast deleted.
Yeah. As many people know me, I don't love running, but I do love people exercising. So what I would tell them is, if they've never run before or they haven't done much running, again, is just starting slow and working your way up and seeing how your body responds. So not only starting slow, but then getting that data like Garrett does throughout all of his runs, as much data as you can, so that way you can really hone in on how your body responds to different distances, different intensities, and the different scenarios leading into those runs, like whether being high, low, food on board, not on board. So that way you can really figure out and manage it well to where it's safe, and you won't have any, severe complications from it.
No. Perfect. Well, with that, I think we ended our first episode with what our blood sugar was. What's something that has really bursted your beta cells recently?
I would say since the last podcast, there's been, since we took our break, I went through a lot of crazy stuff with my insurance, and ultimately got to a spot where I was so frustrated that I actually just canceled my insurance because I was so pissed about, because with it all, like I wasn't getting approved for my insulin. I'm like, I just need insulin. I was getting to the point, and I'd been trying for at least 4 months. And so it was a good thing I started early. And I just got to a point where I'm like, I just need my insulin. If you're not going to give it to me, I'm not going to pay you to not give me insulin. And so I got so frustrated, I just canceled my insurance, and now I'm just paying cash for the insulin. And honestly, I'm saving a lot of money. I can do that obviously because I take care of myself really well. But it was very frustrating.
Wow. Well, that's, I'm sure, has a lot of questions on how you are navigating the world of a diabetic without insurance. But I think it would be best to just leave it at that was bursting your beta cells, and maybe we'll get into that at another time.
Yep.
For me, I would say I was working with a company I was trying a different checker, and I was really excited to use them, and it just kept breaking. And I had to fight with them to get new ones, and then they would send me a new one, and then I would say, well, it's broken again. And then I was like, all right, this just isn't for me. I want a refund, and this and that. And they only gave me a partial refund, and I had to make so many calls and so many leads up their chain of command. Somebody was like, well, I just don't understand how that's possible. I was like, literally, you can go back in your own recordings, because you record every phone conversation. About 2 weeks ago, the last sales associate that I worked with, or a month ago, whatever it was, literally said, well, I guess I'm just the unlucky one that the same sensor has broken on the meter twice, and then you're 1 in a million. That's literally recorded. Your own sales associate told me that. So I don't necessarily care that you don't understand how it's happened, but it's happened, and you've literally said I am just the statistic where it keeps breaking. So, and he's like, all right, let me go talk to my boss, we'll call you back. And then I got a message from my HSA account that all the money was refunded into my bank account. And that was the last I heard from him. But that was frustrating. And
I'm glad it ended in a win, though.
It ended in a win, or no harm, no foul. But it was just it was still just, it took the time to make all those calls. I mean, being diabetic, you got to spend, unless you have no insurance, you got to spend a lot of time on the phone. All right, so that wraps up our second episode of season 2 of the Diabetes podcast. We'll catch you in the next one.
See you.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you found value in today's conversation, we would appreciate it if you gave a 5-star review. It really helps us branch out our community and get our message across to those who really need to hear it. If you want to interact with us on social media, you can follow us on the Diabetes podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Or if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or moral outrages, you can email us at thediabetiespodcast@gmail.com. Thanks.